The alien woman's feet dragged through the sand. The heat was unbearable, and her skin, a smooth blue-gray, burned under the hot sun. She was far from home, and everything around her was dry and barren. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but dust and cracked earth. She looked around, hoping to see something, anything, that might bring her relief. But there was nothing. Not a single tree, no water, not even a shadow to shield her from the burning heat. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, but it only seemed to make the heat worse. She could feel her energy draining with every step she took. Her throat was dry, her body weak. She had been walking for what felt like days, but it could have been only hours. Time didn't matter anymore. Water. She needed water. Desperately. Her home planet had been rich in water once. Lush forests, sparkling oceans, and rivers that ran deep. But all of that was gone now. Her people had fled when their world began to dry up. The oceans shrank, the rivers disappeared, and the rain stopped falling. She and the others had been forced to leave everything behind, searching for a new place to live. Now she was alone. Her ship had crashed on this strange planet, and she had been separated from her crew. She didn't know where they were, or if they had survived. She gasped for air, feeling her body getting weaker with every breath. Her vision began to blur. It was getting harder to see, harder to think. The world around her felt like it was closing in. She stumbled and almost fell, but she managed to catch herself, her hands pressing against the dry earth. She needed water, but where could she find it? Just as she was about to give up, she saw something. It was a shape in the distance, something moving. Her heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was someone who could help her. She pushed herself to stand tall, trying to force her tired legs to carry her toward the shape. The figure was far away, but as she walked, it grew closer. With each step, her hope grew stronger. Could it be a person? Could they have water? The heat made it hard to think straight, and her head felt heavy. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming or if she was really seeing someone. But she didn't care. She had to get to them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the figure. It was a human man, dressed in simple clothes, carrying something in his hand. He was walking slowly, almost as if he didn't notice her approach. His face looked tired, just like hers. When he saw her, he stopped. His eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't look scared. Instead, he took a step forward, holding out the thing in his hand. The alien woman's eyes locked onto it immediately, a small bottle of water. Her throat tightened. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen water, let alone held it in her hands. She had been so thirsty for so long that the sight of it almost made her forget everything else. The human man said something to her, but she didn't understand. His voice was soft, calm, and kind, but the words were foreign to her. Still, the way he held out the bottle told her everything she needed to know. He wanted to help her. Her hand shook as she reached out for the bottle. She was too thirsty to hesitate. As soon as it touched her fingers, she quickly unscrewed the cap. The cool, fresh smell of the water filled her nose, and without thinking, she brought it to her lips. The first drop of water that touched her tongue felt like heaven. It was cold, crisp, and refreshing. She drank more, gulping down as much as she could. She didn't care how much she drank. She was so thirsty, so weak, that all she could think about was the water. For a moment, she forgot everything. The dry desert, the crash, her lost crew, even the strange human standing in front of her. All that mattered was the water. It was the life she needed to survive. When she finally stopped drinking, she pulled the bottle away from her lips. Her hands were still shaking, but she felt better. Not completely strong, but better. Her mind cleared, and she could think again. She looked up at the human, still holding the empty bottle. Her heart swelled with gratitude. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he came from, or why he was here, but she knew one thing for sure. He had saved her life. She stared at him for a long moment, and though she couldn't speak his language, She hoped he understood what she meant. She had no way to thank him with words, but she gave him a small, grateful smile. The human man looked at her, his eyes soft, and then he smiled back. It wasn't a big smile, but it was kind. There was no fear in his eyes, no hatred, just kindness. It was a look she hadn't expected. A look that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. And for the first time since she had arrived on this planet, she didn't feel so desperate. She felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't lost. The offer. The alien woman stood still, staring at the human man. He was holding out the bottle of water to her, his face calm and kind. She still couldn't believe it. After all the days of wandering alone in the desert, after all the thirst and fear, here was someone who was offering her what she needed most: water. Her heart raced, and she could feel the warmth of the sun on her skin. Her legs were tired, and her head was spinning, but the sight of the bottle in the human's hand gave her a rush of hope. She knew she should be careful, that she didn't know this man or where he came from, but her thirst was stronger than her fear. The human didn't move, his eyes steady on her. He wasn't rushing her, just holding the water out, waiting for her to take it. She felt the weight of his gaze, but it wasn't threatening. It was calm, patient, as if he truly wanted to help. For a moment, the alien woman hesitated. She had heard stories about humans. They were not always friendly, and not all of them were trustworthy. But the way he stood there, with no weapon, no sign of harm, just the simple offer of water, felt different. She could sense there was no danger in his eyes. Her dry throat ached as she took a small step forward. Her hands shook as she reached out, and she could barely keep her balance. The human man seemed to notice this and took a step closer, making sure she could reach the bottle without falling. As she grabbed the bottle, their fingers brushed against each other. The brief touch sent a strange feeling through her body. It wasn't fear. It was something new, something soft and warm. She couldn't explain it, but she felt safe. She could trust him, at least for now. She quickly unscrewed the cap and brought the bottle to her lips. The cool water spilled into her mouth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt relief. It was like she had been holding her breath for days, and now she could finally exhale. The water was cold and fresh, and it slid down her throat like a dream. She drank deeply, not caring about anything else. She hadn't realized how thirsty she had been until that moment. Her body was starving for water, and now, with each swallow, she felt stronger. The dizziness in her head started to fade, and her legs stopped shaking. Her mind cleared, and for a brief moment, she felt like herself again. When the bottle was almost empty, she pulled it away from her lips and looked at the human man. She had drunk more than she had planned, but she still felt like she could drink more. But she stopped. She didn't want to take everything he had. She didn't know how much he had left, and she didn't want to seem greedy. She looked at him, wondering if he was angry, but his expression was still the same, calm and understanding. He didn't say a word, but his eyes seemed to say everything she needed to hear. He wasn't upset. He wasn't angry that she had drunk so much. In fact, he looked pleased, as if he was happy to see her getting better. The alien woman gave a small nod of thanks, holding the empty bottle in her hands. She couldn't speak his language, but she hoped he could understand her gratitude. She looked at the human, her mind racing. Who was he? What was he doing here on this strange, empty planet? Was he lost too? The human man glanced down at the bottle and then back at her. He didn't seem bothered by the fact that she had taken most of the water. Instead, he pointed to the sky and then pointed in the direction where she had come from. He said something in a language she couldn't understand, but his gestures were clear. He was trying to show her something. Maybe he wanted to help her find more water. The alien woman tilted her head, confused. She didn't understand what he was trying to say, but his body language seemed friendly. He wasn't trying to push her away. He was offering her something more. She looked around, trying to see if there was anything else nearby that could help. There was nothing. The land was dry and empty, just like before. But the man's offer of water had given her a new sense of hope. She wasn't as weak now, and she felt like she could go on. But for how long? The human man took another step toward her, holding his hand out as if inviting her to follow him. He didn't force her, but his gesture was kind and welcoming. His smile was small but sincere, and the alien woman found herself stepping forward without thinking. She had no idea where he was going or why he was here, but she couldn't stay alone in the desert. She needed help, and maybe, just maybe, this human man could offer it. She nodded slowly and handed the empty bottle back to him. He took it without a word and put it back into his pack. Without saying anything more, he turned and started walking. The alien woman followed him, her feet moving faster than they had in days. As they walked side by side, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew that with him, she wasn't alone. And that, for now, was enough. A moment of trust. The alien woman followed the human man without speaking. Her feet moved slowly, but she didn't mind. Her body still felt weak, but the water had helped. Her mind was clearer now, and she could focus on where they were going. She had no idea where they were, but somehow she felt safe with him. The desert stretched on in every direction. The hot sun beat down, but the human man didn't seem bothered by it. He walked confidently, like he had been here before. Every few steps, he would glance back at her, making sure she was still there. His gaze was kind, his expression calm. They didn't talk much, but it wasn't awkward. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. They didn't need words. The alien woman realized that she could understand him in other ways. His gestures, his movements. He had shown her kindness without saying a word. And now, as they walked side by side, it felt like they were communicating without speaking at all. After a while, the human man stopped and turned to face her. He pointed to the ground and then motioned toward himself. Then he touched his chest, as if to show her that he was offering something important. His eyes were serious, but not unfriendly. The alien woman watched him carefully. She wasn't sure what he was trying to say, but his actions made it clear that he was trying to communicate. She shook her head slightly, unsure. She still didn't understand his words, but his body language seemed to say he wasn't angry with her. He wasn't rushing her. He was just trying to help. Then, without saying anything, he motioned for her to follow him. He turned and started walking again, and the alien woman hesitated for a moment. Could she trust him? Was he leading her into danger, or was he really trying to help her? Her mind raced with questions. She didn't know him, but somehow she felt like she could trust him. He had already shown her kindness by giving her water, and when she had been weak and lost, he hadn't left her behind. Instead, he had walked beside her. She wasn't alone anymore. Taking a deep breath, the alien woman decided to trust him. She took a step forward, then another, until she was walking beside him again. Her body was still tired, but her heart felt lighter. She felt like she could take on whatever was ahead, as long as she wasn't alone. They walked for a while, the silence between them comfortable. The desert wasn't as scary with someone by her side. The heat was still intense, but now it didn't feel so overwhelming. The human man seemed at ease, even in this dry, empty land. After some time, they reached a small hill, and the man paused, looking around. He pointed to a small spot in the distance, where a few trees stood. The alien woman could barely see them at first, but as she focused, she noticed the green shadows. There was something there, a sign of life in the middle of all the dryness. The man turned to her and smiled. This time, it was a bigger smile, showing his teeth. He pointed toward the trees again, then made a motion like he was drinking from a cup. His eyes were sparkling with hope, and she realized he was showing her that there was water there. She could feel her heart skip a beat. Could it be true? Was there really water ahead? She nodded, her own face lighting up. She didn't need to speak to understand what he meant. Water. There was water ahead. They began walking faster now, their steps in sync. The alien woman's legs felt stronger, as though the promise of water gave her new energy. The man kept his pace steady, but now she could feel the urgency in his steps. He, too, was eager to reach the spot. As they got closer, the trees became clearer. There were small plants growing around the base of the trees, and the ground looked softer. The alien woman could smell something different in the air. It was the scent of fresh, living things. The heat seemed to ease, and a cool breeze blew past her, bringing with it the promise of water. When they reached the trees, the human man stopped and turned to her. He made a gesture like he was offering her something again. But this time, she understood. He wasn't just offering water. He was offering her hope. The trust she had begun to feel for him grew even stronger. The alien woman stood still for a moment, taking it all in. She was standing under the shade of the trees, the air cooler, the ground softer. There was no longer that overwhelming sense of danger. She had been lost, weak, and alone just hours ago. But now, there was a sense of peace. The human man smiled at her again, and she returned the smile. It wasn't just a smile of thanks. It was a smile of understanding. She realized that for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. She wasn't just following him anymore. They were walking together, side by side, both with the same goal: survival. The alien woman looked at him and felt something deep inside her stir. It was a feeling she hadn't expected. It was trust. A quiet, growing bond that didn't need words to exist. For the first time since she had crash-landed on this planet, she wasn't afraid. She knew now that she wasn't alone. She wasn't just following him. She was walking beside him, sharing a moment of trust. And that made all the difference. The story begins to unfold. The alien woman and the human man sat under the shade of the trees, a welcome relief from the harsh sun. The air was cooler now, and the ground felt soft beneath them. They were still far from understanding each other completely, but the silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. The human man had found a small pool of water near the trees, and the alien woman had drunk deeply, grateful for the life-giving liquid. It was the first real sense of safety she had felt since her ship had crashed. Now, as she rested beside him, she could hear the sound of water trickling in the small stream that ran near them. The man had already started working. He moved carefully, his hands skilled and steady. He seemed to know what he was doing, as if this was not the first time he had been in a place like this. He found a few large leaves and began making something, his actions smooth and practiced. The alien woman watched him, curious. She didn't know why he was here, or how he had come to be on this strange planet. He was different from her, but there was something about him that made her feel safe. For now, that was enough. After a while, the man stopped working and turned to her. He pointed to the items he had gathered, then to himself, then to her. He made the same motion he had before, as if offering something, but this time, the alien woman understood more clearly. He wasn't just offering kindness. He was offering to share what he had, his resources, his help. It was more than just a gift. It was an invitation. The alien woman felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. She nodded slowly, understanding his gesture. She hadn't expected this. She had come to this planet alone. And now here was a stranger, someone she didn't know, offering help, offering to share. It made her feel less alone. She reached out and accepted what he had made. It wasn't much, just a simple tool, crafted from the materials he had gathered. But to her, it was a sign of something more. It was a connection, something that could help her survive in this harsh world. The human man didn't speak, but his eyes shone with something that made the alien woman feel like she wasn't a stranger, like she wasn't a threat. He smiled again, his face soft and welcoming. The alien woman stared at him for a moment, and something inside her stirred. This was the beginning of something important. She could feel it in her chest, a small spark of hope that had started to grow. The moment stretched between them. The air felt thick with understanding, though neither of them could explain it. They didn't need words. They didn't need to speak the same language. Their actions, their silent offers, were enough to bridge the gap. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She didn't feel like an alien. The alien woman watched the human man closely. He wasn't looking at her in fear or with suspicion. He was simply offering what he had, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had never expected to find someone like him, especially not on a planet like this, so far from home. The sun was beginning to set, and the sky above them shifted into shades of orange and pink. The human man stood up and stretched, his movements slow and relaxed. He glanced at her, then back at the horizon, as if considering something. Then he pointed to the sky and made a motion with his hands, as though showing her the stars. The alien woman followed his gaze, confused at first. What was he trying to say? Was he telling her that night was coming? Or was he saying something more? She stood up, walking over to him. Without saying anything, she touched the sky with her fingers, then looked at him, hoping for an answer. The man looked at her for a long moment, and then, as if understanding her question, he pointed to the horizon and made a sweeping motion, as if showing her the whole world. His eyes were bright, his face serious, but there was something in his expression, something that made her feel like he was telling her that there was more to this place than what they had seen so far. She felt a small spark of curiosity. What was he trying to tell her? What did he know that she didn't? She wanted to know. She wanted to understand him, and more than that, she wanted to understand this place. Why had her ship crashed here? What was this world, really? The human man smiled at her, a knowing look in his eyes. He wasn't offering her just shelter or water. He was offering something bigger, something that she could only begin to understand. For a moment, she felt like the answers were just within her reach. Like this strange human, with his kindness and silent understanding, held the key to something that could change everything. But the moment passed quickly, and she realized that they would have to go on this journey together. They would have to discover the truth of this world, and the truth about themselves, step by step. The alien woman took a deep breath and looked at him again. The world seemed a little less empty now, with him beside her. She wasn't sure where they were going, or what would happen next, but she knew that this was just the beginning. The story was unfolding, and she was a part of it. And with him, maybe she could find the answers she had been searching for. She smiled back at him, not with words, but with her eyes. She was ready. Whatever came next, they would face it together. A promise. The stars were out now, twinkling brightly in the dark sky. The alien woman sat quietly, her back resting against the rough bark of one of the trees. She had never seen a sky like this before, so clear and full of light. The desert around them had become calm as the heat of the day faded, replaced by the cool air of night. The world felt different now. It wasn't as empty as before. The human man had made a small fire, the flames flickering in the darkness. He sat beside it, watching the fire dance. He had gathered some food, simple things, but it was enough. He had shared it with her, and now they both sat together in the stillness of the night. The crackling sound of the fire was the only noise between them. The alien woman looked at the fire, then at the human man. She wasn't sure what to say. She didn't speak his language, and he didn't speak hers. But something about the way he looked at her made her feel like they didn't need words. They had come to understand each other in their own way, through small actions, shared moments, and silent trust. She had felt weak and lost when she had first arrived on this planet. But now, with him by her side, she felt different, stronger. There was still so much she didn't understand, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone anymore. He had become her only companion, and she had come to rely on him. The human man broke the silence, his voice low and calm. He spoke in the same language as before, but she still didn't understand the words. Yet the tone of his voice was gentle, and there was something reassuring in it. She could tell that he wasn't just speaking for the sake of talking. He was speaking because he wanted her to know something. He reached out and gently touched her arm, his eyes meeting hers. The alien woman looked at him, waiting, unsure of what to do. His touch wasn't forceful. It was warm, comforting. A silent promise. He didn't need to say anything more. She understood. He was telling her that he would not leave her, that she could trust him. Her heart beat a little faster, and she felt something stir inside her. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was a feeling she hadn't experienced before. It was the feeling of safety, of belonging. She wasn't sure how to respond, but she felt the need to do something, to show him that she understood. The alien woman took a deep breath, then reached out slowly, her hand touching his. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. It felt like a promise that she, too, would stay. A promise that she wouldn't run away. She would stay by his side, and together, they would face whatever came next. The human man didn't pull away. Instead, he smiled at her, the warmth in his eyes making her feel more at ease. She realized, in that moment, that he had made the first promise. He had promised not to leave her alone in this strange world. And now, she was making her own promise to him. They were in this together. As the fire crackled softly, the alien woman thought about how much had changed since she had met him. She had been lost, confused, and scared. But now, with him beside her, she felt like she was starting to understand the world around her. There was still so much to learn, but she didn't feel as afraid anymore. The human man spoke again, this time in a slower, softer tone. He seemed to be trying to make her understand, even though he knew she didn't speak his language. But his voice was steady, and his words were calm, like a gentle wave lapping against the shore. He didn't ask for anything in return, but she could tell that he wanted her to know that she wasn't a burden. She wasn't a stranger. She was his companion. The alien woman nodded, her eyes locked on his. There were no words between them, but in that moment, words didn't matter. She felt what he was saying deep inside. She wasn't alone anymore. As the night wore on, they sat together in comfortable silence, the fire between them keeping the cold away. The alien woman's mind began to wander. She thought about her past, the life she had left behind, and the future that awaited her. She didn't know what that future would look like, but she knew one thing. She couldn't face it alone. The human man had shown her that. He had shown her that, no matter how dark or empty the world felt, there was always a light. He was that light for her now, and she promised herself that she would be his light too. They would take care of each other. As the fire began to burn lower, the alien woman stood up, stretching her tired body. She looked at the man one more time, her eyes filled with gratitude and understanding. She didn't need to say anything. He could see it in her eyes. The promise was made. She would stand by him. And together, they would survive. Together, they would face whatever came next. The human man stood as well. And for a moment, they just looked at each other, a silent bond forming between them. The stars above them sparkled brightly, as if to say that, no matter how hard the journey ahead might be, they would not be alone. The journey. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. The heat was already building, but it didn't matter. The alien woman and the human man were on the move again. The promise they had made to each other the night before had become a silent bond, guiding them as they walked side by side. They hadn't spoken much, but there was an understanding between them now. They didn't need words. Their actions said everything. The alien woman had learned to trust him, and he had learned to trust her. Together, they had faced the unknown, and together, they would face whatever the day would bring. The desert stretched out before them, endless and barren. There were no signs of life, no trees or animals to be seen. It was a place of emptiness, a harsh world that didn't seem to care about those who walked its surface. But the alien woman didn't feel the weight of it anymore. With the human man beside her, she didn't feel alone. She didn't feel lost. They walked through the day, their steps in sync, the sun beating down on their backs. The alien woman had gotten used to the heat, though it was still difficult to keep going. She felt tired, but every time she looked at the human man, she felt a little more energy. He seemed tireless, moving with purpose. He had a way of making it all look easy, though she knew it wasn't. The human man stopped every once in a while to check the path ahead. He would pause, scanning the horizon, his eyes sharp. The alien woman watched him closely. He was calm, even in the face of the unknown, and his quiet confidence gave her strength. When they stopped for a short break, the human man took a small pack from his back and pulled out some water. He offered it to her first, and she accepted without hesitation. She had come to trust him with her life, and she knew he would never let her go without. After she drank, she passed the water back to him. He took a long sip, then put the cap back on. They didn't need to speak about the things that mattered most. The moments between them were simple, and that was enough. There was something comforting in that simplicity. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The flat desert ground started to rise in small hills. The alien woman's heart quickened. Could this mean they were nearing something? She had no idea, but the change in the terrain made her feel hopeful. She wanted to believe that something was ahead, something that would make all this walking worth it. The human man seemed to sense her change in mood. He turned to her and gave her a small, reassuring smile. His eyes said everything. "We're getting closer," they seemed to say. And the alien woman believed him. He hadn't led her wrong so far. As they climbed one of the small hills, they stopped at the top to survey the land below them. The desert stretched far, but in the distance she saw something. It was faint, but she could make out the outline of something dark against the horizon. It looked like a cluster of rocks or maybe a canyon. The human man nodded, seeing what she saw. His hand moved to his pack, and he began to walk forward. But this time, there was a new urgency in his steps. The alien woman followed quickly, her pace matching his. Whatever it was in the distance, it was something that might change everything. As they moved closer, the air grew cooler. The wind picked up, and the heat of the sun didn't feel as harsh. It was as though the world was changing again, offering them something new. Hope. They were almost there. They finally reached the area, and the alien woman stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Before them lay a small canyon with deep, rich soil at the bottom. The trees here were different from the ones they had seen before, tall and strong, with thick leaves that provided cool shade. And in the middle of the canyon, a stream of fresh water flowed, sparkling in the light. The human man looked at her, his eyes shining with excitement. He had led her here. After all the walking, all the days of heat and dryness, they had found it. She had been alone, afraid of this strange planet. But now, everything had changed. She had a purpose. She had a companion. And with him, she felt strong. The sun was higher in the sky now, the warmth of the day beginning to settle in. The alien woman felt the heat, but it didn't bother her. She was no longer afraid of the desert. She was no longer afraid of being alone. With the human man beside her, she knew they could survive anything. They spent the day working, gathering food, setting up a shelter near the stream. There was so much to do, but they didn't mind. Every task, every small action brought them closer to their new life. They were building something together, and that was what mattered most. As evening came, they sat by the fire they had built, eating the food they had gathered. The alien woman looked around at their small camp, at the shelter they had made, the fire they had started, and the stream that flowed nearby. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a beginning. The human man turned to her and spoke for the first time in hours. His voice was quiet, but it carried a sense of certainty. He pointed to the stars above, then to the earth beneath them, as if to say that this was their new world now. This was where they would build their future. The alien woman nodded, understanding what he meant. This was their home now. It was a place where they could live, grow, and survive. They had found each other in the darkness of space, and now they had found a place to start over. Together. As the fire crackled between them, the alien woman felt a deep sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she was ready. She was ready to face it with the human man by her side. The stars above them twinkled brightly, as if to say that anything was possible. The alien woman looked at them and smiled. The journey they had taken was over. But this was only the beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next. And in that moment, she knew it would be enough.